there's no more appropriate place to be talking about space than in Central Florida. If you think about it, we're the only functional place on the planet where we have quadruple transportation opportunities in a functional basis. I mean, you can get by land, either rail or automobile. You can get by sea. The second greatest cruise port in the face of the planet is right here 30 miles from us. And of course, you can get into space. This is the best place in America to launch east-west satellites because of the way the Earth rotates and because of the fact that our space wing down there at Patrick Air Force Base, which Dave Weldon will tell you more about, literally controls some 15 million miles of low Earth orbit as we shoot trajectories into space. And it is a great place to be talking about space because both of our history and our future. I will tell you that I'm not a scientist by background. I'm a political scientist. On the campaign trail, I like to joke that my political adversaries point out that I'm no rocket scientist, and that's true. But I am married to somebody who's an engineer at Kennedy Space Center, so being married to a rocket scientist is the next best thing. I thought that I'd give you a little overview to sort of start the discussion about where we are in space today in terms of some of the past challenges and successes that we've had in America. We enter a new millennium, and with this new millennium, I believe deeply, I think most of the speakers that you'll hear from today, that there is a new opportunity and a new challenge for America's space exploration, and that vision for space exploration needs to build on the successes we've had. We need to take things a lot further, and we have an opportunity to do that. We need to transition into a new era of space exploration while learning from our past, but also breaking the molds of things that we've done in the past to do new and exciting things. One of the things that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board observed is that the shuttle is an aging developmental system and should be replaced with another means of transporting humans into space. The shuttle probably will last until somewhere around the year 2010, maybe 2012 or 2013. We will complete the mission with our international space stations, if I have anything to say about it. But that is today's space human travel vision. We need a new vision for tomorrow. Secondly, the Accident Investigation Board said that America needed a new, clearly defined long-term mission for human spaceflight. While making those recommendations, the Columbia Board was urging a break from the post-Apollo era that emphasized the use of the shuttle, but without a focused human mission on space flight. At the time, my response was that America must pursue measured and well-conceived space objectives that emphasize scientific discovery and increase the potential for manned exploration beyond low Earth orbit. Dreams must be tempered with the challenges posed by space's very unforgiving environment. A few months later, President Bush unveiled America's vision for space exploration. This is really the first vision we've had since President Reagan proposed the International Space Station that has an administration strongly behind it in terms of a new vision. It was a bold, focused, and paced transition from the shuttle and International Space Station to exploration breaking out of low Earth orbit. America would fulfill our obligations to the International Space Station and continue our research. Then we will redirect our efforts and resources to a journey ultimately to the moon again and then well beyond, potentially to Mars. Progress will be determined by resources, technology developments, and lessons learned. This is a flexible program. This is not a 10-step program for the next 30 years of space. At every stage, we will learn things, hopefully from our successes, but unfortunately in the world of science, it's often your failures from which you learn the most from. Sometimes our failures are tragic in space, but nonetheless, every failure, every scientist can learn from and improve the opportunities for tomorrow. The President has made clear that this is a journey and not a race. We're not in a foot race with a foreign power at the moment to dominate any particular part of space, but at every step we need to learn from where we've been. We need to look at the new potential opportunities, and we will discover opportunities that we can't even imagine here today. For advocates of human space flight, the vision for space exploration is bold and thoughtful strategic plan. The vision includes transitioning America from the shuttle era to a new era of exploration beyond low Earth orbit. It ensures that the Kennedy Space Center's unique launch facilities will be used for decades. That's important to our economy. It's also important to America's continued leadership in space. It preserves American superiority in space, including the development of technologies that benefit both civilian and national security uses of space. Such superiority provides a force multiplier for our troops in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and allows us to project military power throughout the world. Let me stop here and make a couple points. Dave Weldon is going to talk to you. He has a great background in science and space exploration, both civilian and military. But I want you to think about how critical it is that America not cede space superiority to some hostile nation one day or some rogue terrorist organization. If you think about the history of nation states, for several millennia of human history, whoever dominated ground wars was able to determine their destiny. The Roman Empire, for example, was built on the back of the Roman legions. For about 300 years, whoever controlled the naval superiority on our globe was able to basically dominate and control their destiny. The British built their empire on the back of the Navy. There are some 13 choke points on the globe, and if you can control some or most of them, you are able to control your destiny and, of course, fend off hostile powers. For the last 60 years, it's been air superiority. And thankfully, America and her allies have been able to dominate airspace so that we can make our men and women on the ground even more capable than if the other side was able to. We may be speaking German today, for example, if the Germans had been able to dominate air. I believe in the future, whoever dominates low Earth and ultimately high Earth orbit is going to be able to control their destiny. The average man or woman on the ground in Iraq in the most recent war was not worth 10 or 100 of our adversaries as we lined up to do traditional warfare, but more like 1,000 or 10,000 because of the incredible capabilities that satellites give us. In the war on terror, intelligence is an absolute requisite. You can't wait until after the event. This is not an army that's going to line up in front of you in uniforms and with tanks that you can just outmuscle. If you don't know where that strike in some major American city is going to occur beforehand, you are simply totally incapacitated. Human intelligence, along with our satellite dominance in space technology, is an absolute requisite to preserving the American way of life, and only America, in my view, has both the technological capability and the moral determination not to use this for evil purposes. I think we have an absolute moral obligation to lead in space. Now, that's not something that's NASA's primary mission. Our defense guys do that. I think Dave Weldon will talk to you about it. But when the Wright brothers invented the ability to fly, they probably didn't think about dominating air battles 50 years later on the globe. When Henry Ford produced the great assembly line, creating automobiles, he probably wasn't thinking about building some of the best tanks that were able to successfully win World Wars I and II for America. We need to transform from the original Cold War paradigm, which is a lot of what we did in terms of getting America into space, intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example. Today's challenge to NASA specifically on the civilian side is to create a sustainable space program in a post-Cold War era. Indeed, the transformation is similar to that being undertaken by the Department of Defense in dealing with the challenges of a post-Cold War world. By the way, NASA and Defense are working better and closer than ever, thanks to the leadership of people like Sean O'Keefe. On the defense side, Vice President Cheney and Don Rumsfeld have, for the last 15, 20 years, been huge advocates of space needs in the defense side. And so we've got a better working relationship between the civilian and the defense side than ever. I think that's critical. President Eisenhower was the first American president to really have an administration that thought deeply and consistently about space. He had two national security priorities for space. Number one is developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads. You'll remember this was in the days, for those of you that have studied geopolitical strategy, of mutual assured destruction. And if you think about the ballistic missile treaties that we engaged in with the Soviets, the idea was not to break down offensive capabilities. The idea was to break down defensive capabilities. We wanted to be sure that if the other side pulled the trigger and created unacceptable harm to America, that we could do the same, that we had the time to do it. So when, for example, the Nixon administration negotiated missile treaties, it was to make sure neither side could defend itself from an unacceptable attack from the other side. The theory being that you had two rational opponents in the Cold War, and neither side would do anything that ultimately would destroy a significant part of their population. Unfortunately, our enemies today are not as rational as the Soviets. and they are perfectly willing to engage in, for example, suicide attacks and bombs. We cannot count on the type of mutual assured destruction theory that geopolitical scientists in America and the Soviet Union engaged in, really to keep the unhappy or uncomfortable, but nonetheless a peace for the better part of 3 decades. Eisenhower did resist a space race. He wanted to develop spy satellites, the Corona project in specific, that would provide regular peeks into a secretive Soviet society especially skilled in denial and deception. There was very little information about what the Soviets were up to. If you look today at, for example, North Korea, we have very little knowledge about what the North Koreans are doing underground in terms of building a nuclear capability to strike throughout the Far East. Places like China, potentially Japan, which is an enemy of the North Koreans, potentially strike South Korea. They've always been able to strike Seoul with a lot of biological and chemical weapons for the last 15, 20 years. But someday, the North Koreans, left to their own devices, if they stay on this track, will be able to strike the west side of the United States continent and, of course, Hawaii as well. During the 60s, so-called missile gap debate, where President Kennedy asserted as a candidate in 1960's election that there was a significant missile gap, the Soviets had developed a superior nuclear strike force and atomic capability to America. The truth of the matter is that we had great intelligence that showed that simply wasn't true. Nixon, in those debates and discussions, didn't use the intelligence he had for the very reason that if he had said publicly that, in fact, President Kennedy's assertions were wrong at the time President Kennedy was Senator Kennedy, he would have tipped the hand of the capabilities we had, which the Russians didn't know about until much later in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we literally had to go to the UN and show pictures that our space surveillance capabilities had provided. Both Kennedy and Johnson in office were huge supporters of space, as you well know. While it's now legendary in terms of the commitment that President Kennedy had to space, it didn't start out that way. He started basically with Eisenhower's steady approach, and only because he experienced 2 major concurrent setbacks. The Soviets launched the first man into space, alarming the American public in terms of the capabilities, and secondly, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed miserably, in part because of less than perfect intelligence. In order to contain the political damage, President Kennedy gave his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas and a huge supporter of space exploration, carte blanche to pursue a more ambitious space program. So out of the political and geopolitical fights of the 60s came President Kennedy's huge commitment that really kicked off the space program as we know it today. America ultimately won the space race when Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July 1969. Believe me, the world was totally enthralled. When the Apollo 11 landed on the moon, it showed the incredible story of American ingenuity and American resolve. The comparable Soviet program, cloaked as usual in secrecy, couldn't even get its Saturn V equivalent to fly successfully, let alone to get on the moon. After winning the race, NASA ran out of immediate challenges, and actually there was sort of a lull there in terms of creative and exciting thinking. The champions of Apollo, President Kennedy and Johnson, were gone from the scene, and there were other distractions, like the Cold War, for example, like domestic problems. You remember the 60s and the 70s, a lot of the problems we had in cities. And one of the things I am afraid of is that we will have similar distractions with the war on terror that will take away from our commitment and our firm resolve to have a successful space program. I think that some of the lessons applied to the future vision that we can learn from the history of America's space is that space enthusiasts yearn to return to the days of Apollo, where exciting things could happen very rapidly. Regulations and bureaucracy didn't get in the way very often in those days. But those days were unique and in many ways unsustainable and very different from our days today. The Cold War that triggered Kennedy's race no longer exists. The space community has to acknowledge this fact and transform itself to handle in today's challenges and opportunities. Let me suggest that the President's vision acknowledges that fact while retaining the target of a long-term destination. And I think it's more like the Eisenhower approach, which is steady, firm, make sure that you are accomplishing your needs both on the civilian and the defense side. And finally, I want to give you some historical lessons as I close and turn it over to my friend Ric Keller. If you think about the history of exploration, Typically, it's very dangerous. Typically, it's very difficult and very challenging terrains that don't provide things like the atmosphere or the food for human sustenance for very long. So you've got all these huge hurdles to overcome. Typically, it takes huge amounts of resources and huge risks for a public to support significant exploration programs. And because of all those things, there are basically two things historically that seem to be requisite. One or the other or both have to be in place. Number one, exploration is driven by war, or exploration is driven by gold, or it is driven by both. If you think about the Vikings, they wanted to conquer their enemies, but they also wanted to ravish their riches and steal them home. If you think about, for example, Columbus's exploration of the West Indies and the United States, what's the chance that Queen Isabella had given Columbus the resources he needed to get to where he ultimately got to? If she had known, she would have had to share all the riches that he collected with people like the Dutch and the French and the Brits. And unfortunately, in a lot of our space treaties on the globe, that's exactly what we do. We privatize the costs of space exploration, but we socialize all of the rewards. It's actually prohibited that anybody can own anything in space. I think these treaties need to be re-examined. A lot of them are coming up, and we will be able to modify and amend those to encourage space exploration. Let's hope that it's not because of the need to protect our very existence through the threat of international or global war or terror that leads us into space predominance in the future, as we have had in the past. But there's only one safe way to preserve our way of life, and in my view, that is to make sure that both on the civilian and defense side, we maintain America's historic predominance in space, and I'm committed to that goal. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
On January 14, 2004, President George W. Bush announced a major new long-term goal for NASA. The President directed NASA to focus its spaceflight program to returning humans to the Moon by 2020 and then on to Mars. This speech was given 11 months after the tragedy of the Columbia Space Shuttle accident and 2 weeks after the January 3, 2004 successful landing of the U.S. robotic probe Spirit on Mars. The space shuttle had made 113 flights, 2 of which ended in tragedy, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in February of 2003. Under President Bush's new vision, the space shuttle would be retired in 2010 and the U.S. would stop the major funding of the International Space Station in 2017. The new goal of returning astronauts to the Moon and then on to Mars was met with both praise and skepticism. The President was praised for finally providing NASA with a clear, long-term goal for the nation's human spaceflight program. The President's proposal was also met with skepticism because the President didn't say how much going to the Moon and Mars would cost and pledged only $1 billion in new money over the next 5 years to pay for it. For example, Mike Thomas, a columnist for the Orlando Sentinel, wrote, quote, Bush pledged a paltry $200 million a year for 5 years on an initiative that will cost upward of $1 trillion. This is like promising my wife that we are moving to Isleworth, then demonstrating my commitment by socking away $50 a month. Well, the public is also split. An Associated Press poll from January 2004 revealed that 48% of people are in favor of a Moon-Mars program, 48% are opposed, and 4% are not sure. Fortunately, as a regular congressman who doesn't work directly with NASA on a day-to-day basis, I can give you my objective analysis on the NASA situation. And in the interest of straight talk, I will give you what I see to be the pluses and the minuses. I can tell you that there are 2 competing visions as to the future of NASA's human spaceflight program. On the one hand, some people believe that space is an undiscovered frontier and that going to the Moon and Mars is a worthwhile endeavor despite the steep cost because it will lift our spirits and lead to new scientific discoveries. On the other hand, others believe that at a time when we are running record budget deficits with new expensive obligations because of Iraq and prescription drugs for seniors under Medicare, we cannot afford a potential $1 trillion trip to the Moon and Mars unless NASA can first tell us the tangible benefits in the form of national security and medical discoveries. Today, I will lay out what I think is the best case for each side so that you can make up your own minds. First, I'll lay out the case for those who believe that the Moon-Mars trip is worth pursuing. To put this argument in perspective, let me also begin, as Congressman Feeney did briefly, by telling you the story of an explorer, Christopher Columbus. Columbus's dream was to find a new way to the east. In 1482, he asked the King of Portugal for 3 ships to make the journey. The king said, "No, we don't have the money." Columbus then tried the King of France. He said no. He then tried the King of England. He also said no. Finally, in 1492, Columbus went to the King and Queen of Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. At first, Queen Isabella refused to give him the money. But luckily for us, the Queen ended up giving Columbus the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, 90 crew members, and the money to make the journey. Columbus, of course, never made it to the east. Instead, he discovered the New World. What if the Queen of Spain had said, "Chris, I'm sorry, but there's no money for your exploration. We'd rather spend the money on health care, education, road building, and other domestic priorities"? How long would it have taken to find America? Spain might have had a few more bullfights, but half the world would have been left undiscovered. Well, space is today's undiscovered frontier. Our NASA astronauts are today's Christopher Columbuses. Like Columbus, Americans want to understand their world and what lies beyond. NASA embodies the spirit of discovery. And on the road to exploration, it's important to point out the tangible benefits. Americans need to know what's in it for them. Well, space exploration has already improved our lives in many tangible ways that we don't always think about. Let me give you just a few examples. First, the medical technology that saves lives, like CAT scanners and MRI machines, were first developed for use in space. Second, satellites and space technology have improved weather forecasting and helped us to better track hurricanes with greater advance warnings. We've had 4 major hurricanes hit Florida in the past 6 weeks. Thousands of lives, especially those folks who live in mobile homes, were probably saved because this technology helped give us advance warning. Third, space travel has led to environmental advances, giving us better water purifiers, solar energy technology, pollution monitors, air purifiers, energy-saving air conditioners, and zero-emission hydrogen fuel cells now being used in cars. And fourth, because there's no gravity in space, NASA has the only scale in the world that shows that I've actually lost weight. So I appreciate that. I could have tried the Dr. Hitt approach, the diet and exercise, but it's just too hard. Now, let me give you the other side as best I can. And I'm just presenting both sides. I'm trained as a lawyer, so I can defend about anything. So let me give you the other side. We have a record budget deficit of over $420 billion. We have already spent nearly $200 billion in Iraq, and more will be spent in the future. We have a new Medicare prescription drug benefit for seniors that will cost over $500 billion over the next 10 years. Alan Greenspan says the entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security will face a major funding crisis in the future, and our national debt is approaching $7 trillion. Under these budget circumstances, some folks believe that we cannot afford a $1 trillion black hole merely because going to the moon and Mars will lift our spirits and show that we achieved a goal. Which brings us to the next question. How much will the Moon-Mars endeavor cost? We don't know. Neither the White House nor NASA has clearly articulated how much the trip to the moon and Mars will ultimately cost. This is what we do know. In 1989, the first President Bush floated the idea of possibly returning astronauts to the moon and then Mars. At that time, the White House budget director, Richard Darman, estimated that it would cost $400 billion. Some are skeptical that the real number is today actually much higher, and with some reason. NASA initially said the space station would cost $8 billion, yet it may ultimately cost $100 billion. In short, this little trip to the Mars may cost us over $1 trillion. If we want the nice racing stripe on the side of the space plane, it's an extra $50. But we're looking at a huge sum here. So there you have it. There are clearly two sides to this debate over NASA's future, and I've tried to present both of them to you in this short period of time. Where do I stand? At this time, I remain open-minded. I think it's premature at this point to endorse or reject the President's proposed mission to the Moon and Mars. Why? Because there are four specific questions that must first be answered. First, how much would the total Moon-Mars endeavor cost? Second, are these cost estimates credible, or are they lowballed like the International Space Station? Third, is there a tangible benefit to our country's national security, such as space exploration and technology that will be used to research and deploy a space-based missile defense program? Fourth, what are the tangible medical research and scientific research benefits from this Moon-Mars trip that we hope to achieve, and why is space exploration the only way to achieve them? My support in Congress turns on the answers to those questions, and let me give you an explanation of why. I believe strongly in a national missile defense system to protect our national security. The experts who have briefed me on this issue tell me that a space-based national missile defense system is by far the best approach. Why? When an enemy launches a nuclear missile against us, the best way to hit that missile is when it is just launched and is a fat, hot target. The only way to intercept that missile quickly enough is to use a space-based system. Historically, however, there has been a wall between NASA's civilian mission and our military. As of today, there is no indication, one way or the other, whether the Moon-Mars endeavor will further this technology, and if so, whether it will be shared with our military. These key questions need to be answered. I don't know what the answers will be, but I do know I will look at it in an objective, honest, nonpartisan fashion and try my best to do the right thing. In closing, Neil Armstrong once said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." On the other hand, a friend of mine, Earl Armstrong, once said, $1 trillion to go to Mars? Damn, that's a lot of money. Thank you, and God bless you all.
I'm old enough to remember when Wernher von Braun came to this country, and I believe it was Mr. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, John Kennedy was president, and the hue and cry then was that our science education across our educational system was such that we could not compete. It would seem to me that the greater driver in the investment in NASA versus that of China, which is not, or other countries that may be able to compete, but that education might be the most important driver, because if we have the science education in place, if we have our young people being educated right from first grade all the way through post-secondary education pursuits, it seems to me that that is one of the greatest fortifiers against threats, competition, etc. The question is, in that background, what opportunity, what motivation is there to invest in that driver versus the other? Because I believe if we take care of education, we will take care of the other. If we don't have a cadre of scientists, etc., then and the threat does present itself in a real way, and or the competition, then we won't have the infrastructure in people to perform. So my question is, what investment is there being made in that driver versus the other? Thank you.
I'm going to let Rick play cleanup here, because he is our education expert in Florida, really, in the U.S. House of Representatives. And I think you're going to find that we're totally aligned on this. One of the advantages of having an aggressive space program, by the way, is to enhance the imagination of young people as they grow up in grade school and decide that they want to emphasize studies in space and math and other sciences. So I think that's a big advantage. The second thing I want to talk about is that we have an aging group of experts in aerospace and science-related matters at Kennedy Space Center and throughout the NASA program. We really are going to have a huge job filling the knowledge gap as these people start to retire, because, as you point out, we are falling behind folks like the Chinese in terms of the emphasis on the percentage of people that go into the soft sciences in the United States. So far too many, in my opinion, including the profession that Rick and I engage in or did before we went to Congress, which is the law. I think we need to have our best and brightest focused and encouraged to go into the sciences. I want to pick up with, before Rick tells you about how important we think the education fits into this challenge, you mentioned Werner von Braun, who of course led the German rocket team, and actually the German rocket team decided to leave Germany, thank goodness, after they developed the technology for the V-2 missile, and they voted unanimously to flee the base where they were in Peenemünde and search for the U.S. Army, where they basically surrendered and offered to help. One of the members of that team, when he explained why they went to the United States Army as opposed to somewhere else, there were a number of other anti-German forces at the time they could have gone to, and I'll quote him, he quotes, "We despise the French." You know, a lot of us can sympathize with that these days. "We're mortally afraid of the Soviets. We do not believe the British can afford us, so that leaves Americans." And unfortunately, in a lot of the moral requisites to do the right thing with technology, whether we like it or not, we're left. We're the only country on the face of the globe, in my view, that has the capability to be the moral authority to use these things for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Well, thank you, Congressman Feeney. I agree with your sentiments about the importance of math and science education. It certainly is on my radar screen. My first term in Congress, I introduced legislation to encourage the development of our math and science high school experts to go to college and major in math and science by providing that they would, above and beyond what they get with the normal Pell Grant of $4,050 a year, get an extra $1,000 every year if they had demonstrated competency in math and science in high school and then had agreed to major in that in college. Legislation didn't move anywhere at the time. We got a lot of co-sponsors, and then I had a break. Earlier this year, President Bush decided to endorse it, and so I reintroduced the legislation called Pell Grant Plus with Congressman Max Burns of Georgia, and this legislation will provide the extra $1,000 to students in high school who are scholars in math and science. There's various ways to show that, but for example, if you pass an advanced placement course in math or science while in high school, if you're a part of any state's Scholastic Scholars Program, you will be eligible for that additional $1,000 solely to reward the math and science folks, to encourage more people to go into math and science. That's going to become law. It's going to become law within a year because I've received permission from our Education Committee Chairman to build that into the Higher Education Act next year, which is required by law to be reauthorized. So we will put some incentives there. Another reason we need those incentives is a recent survey of the large city school superintendents showed that 95% of school superintendents say they have a shortage in their school district of math and science teachers. And the whole reason, for example, that Silicon Valley is what it is today with all those high-paying, high-tech jobs, according to Silicon Valley executives, is because they went there because Berkeley and Stanford were cranking out the math and science graduates. And when I was first elected, I did a town hall meeting, and at that time I represented UCF, and I had all the modeling and simulation and high-tech folks there, and I asked them, what can I do to go from 50,000 high-tech jobs in this area to 100,000? Do you need more venture capital, or what do you need? And they said the answer was in education. We need to crank out the best and the brightest math and science students, and they also wanted a PhD program in modeling and simulation, which would make us unique, one of only 2 in the country, and attract more businesses. And I got them the $5.5 million, and we now have a PhD program, modeling and simulation. So math and science education is critical. More dollars need to be spent, and starting next year, they will be spent.
I saw a report recently that the Air Force is looking into space defense and working on that, and that in conjunction with another report that I also saw several months ago, that something like, during the invasion of Iraq, something like 80 or 90% of all of our communications was delivered through commercial satellites. That, combined with the predicted success of the SS-1 and Virgin Galactic being launched, what do you think about Congress approving, rather than spending for NASA, but funding Air Force and military ventures into space for the high orbit that you spoke of, moving out of low orbit, leaving that to commercial prospects?
Well, that's a great question. I've been out to Colorado Springs, where they literally have a space wing that tracks everything that is in orbit over the size of a baseball, some 8,000 pieces of space junk. And if you can think sort of like a physicist would think, before we send a shuttle into space, not only do we worry about the clouds and thunder and those sorts of weather things here on the ground, but they are literally watching what happens, and they draw a box around the shuttle. And they make sure that through the entire flight of the shuttle that you're not going to have any space junk, because things move very rapidly out there. Something the size of a baseball or larger, there's 8,000 of these that we track 24/7. If any one of those hit the shuttle, the thing would explode while it was orbiting the Earth. It's incredible what they do. You talked about communications for the military. I talked about the weaponry capabilities. Remember, in the first Iraq War, only about 10% of our weapons were smart bombs. It was more like 90% used this last time. We are able to accomplish military objectives. Unlike in the old days when we had to bomb Dresden, we had to destroy a city. We had to literally wipe out places like Hiroshima in order to win the war. Nowadays we can accomplish our military objectives not only with much less loss of life on both sides, but we can leave an entire infrastructure in a country in place while we take out a regime. This is going to be more important than ever, and only through space predominance can we accomplish it. The communications, you're 100% right, but I want you to know what it means to each one of you individually. You know how impatient you are when you have to stand 5 people in line at the bank to cash your check? Americans are now used to being in the streets of Paris, or for that matter in Turkey, Istanbul, Malaysia, and pushing 8 buttons on an ATM machine and being able to get $300 or $500 out. None of that would be working if it weren't for our satellite capabilities. Finally, to get to your specific point, I think you have to do both. I think the civilian side is very important. There are things that the civilian side can do successfully that the military can't do. For example, share information with other countries. But you're exactly right. We need to do a better job than we've done historically in merging the technological advancements and capabilities on the civilian, the commercial. We need to learn every time one of these private guys sends something into low Earth orbit. They understand how important NASA is. There's a lot of things that we can't talk about for security reasons in terms of what we're doing on the defense side of space, but it is more than ever, it is more exciting than ever, and unfortunately it is more necessary than ever. Coordinating between the private, the NASA civilian, and defense is more important than choosing between them. We need to do all three.
In a few hours, Tom and I are going to be flying to Washington, D.C., and we're going to be working on legislation to implement the 9/11 recommendations. And the gist of that is we're going to be creating a National Intelligence Director so that the left hand of the government, the CIA, and the right hand of the government, the FBI, and military, share intelligence better and more efficiently. And I think it's a positive step. For the NASA folks in the room, I think it is imperative that we do the same thing with respect to our space program. There no longer be this tough wall between the information we learn on the civilian side of NASA and information that can be shared with our military. It makes it a lot easier if I can see a tangible national security benefit to the space program to vote for it, even if there's a big ticket number attached to it. And so I hope we will do with NASA and the military just what we're about to do today with our intelligence gathering information, and start sharing intelligence and information in a more cohesive, easy, clear way, because I think it would make our country safer and be the right thing to do. Thank you.